Hey everyone, it's OSK. This video has been a long time coming because today I want to give you a quality guide on the basics of how to play as a Pyromancer. We'll be going over the mechanics of the class, some of the best builds and interactions, and later on in the video I'll even get into some advanced tips and techniques you guys can use in your games with a little bit of practice. I will show all of these and more in this video, but before we get started, do consider dropping a like on the video, subscribing to the channel, doing that YouTube thing, and also consider following me on the socials down in the box below. It really helps me out when you do all that. Now then, enough with all that stuff, let's get into this. So first, what is the Pyromancer class and what is its role? The Pyromancer is described in-game as well-balanced area control, and while it's not entirely wrong, it's not entirely right either. While it is well-balanced, area control is a bit of a stretch. The Pyromancer is more of a well-balanced sustain class that can output some crazy damage when played correctly. It has great burst potential, great tools for tracking opponents, and solid movement built into its kit as well. As a Pyromancer, you'll be able to consistently keep damage on your opponents, follow up on their escape, and overall be a complete nuisance while they attempt to use their own kit. The Pyromancer is an oppressive class that controls the pace of the battle, and when played well, will seal you a lot of exiles. Before we get into the particulars of the Pyromancer's kit, we need to talk about the Fire Gauntlet itself. Its primary spell is a fireball that travels at a constant slow speed and creates a small explosion on impact with the surface or player. Its sorcery creates a wall of fire that can burn enemies and ignite them for a short time. Both of these aspects of fire have some very useful interactions with other elements, and I'll explain a few of the more useful ones right here. Fire and Toxic is a great place to start. You've probably already seen this interaction at some point while watching or playing Spellbreak. The most common way to use this interaction is by throwing a toxic cloud and igniting it with a fireball. This creates an explosion of dragon fire that damages opponents within a large area for a brief amount of time. It also applies corrosion that eats away at your opponent's armor for a brief period. You can also fire toxic at your flame walls for some added damage if your opponent passes through it. Keep in mind though that unlike the toxic cloud, the primary toxic spray will not pass through a flame wall, so you can use that knowledge to defend against toxicologists. Fire and Stone also has decent interactions. Stone's primary, Shockwave, can pass through a flame wall and inflict extra damage by carrying over some of the fire. Boulders can also be ignited by tossing them through flame walls or shooting them with a fireball for extra damage. A flaming boulder will also leave a big fire puddle behind that you can chain into more flaming shockwaves. Fire and wind don't mix very well. Wind shears will blow away any fire puddles and flame walls left on the ground and will push back against fireballs. A tornado will swallow up fireballs and curve their trajectory through the air as well. You can also combine a bit of toxic into a flaming tornado for some explosive results. Finally, Fire and Frost also don't mix, as an Ice Lance will completely cancel out a fireball and a portion of your fire wall. Flash Freeze, Frost's sorcery, will completely block and swallow up any fire in its radius, so be careful against a Frostborn. And sadly, fire does not interact with lightning at all. Now we will get into Pyromancer's class skills. Combust is a fantastic 2-for-1 as it not only increases Pyromancer's fireball explosion radius by 200%, but it also ignites enemies on direct hit. The increased explosion radius allows for a much greater margin of error when enemies are close to a surface like a wall or ceiling. The Ignite, on the other hand, is a great tracking tool as it applies extra damage for 2 ticks of 4 over time, and each time your opponent is damaged by you, their health bar will display on screen along with a small hit sound, letting you essentially track them through walls. The Ignite effect also interrupts attempts to heal and reveals enemies out of invisibility, so it's very useful in more ways than one. Moving on to Firefly, this is Pyromancer's signature movement ability, allowing the user to run directly into a friendly flame wall and fly for a brief period. This can be really useful for escaping and following enemies. It also can be used as an alternative to levitating as it doesn't cost any mana to use in the middle of a fight. Pyrolysis basically just doubles the damage of your flame wall's initial burning effect for 2 seconds. It can be useful to finish out a very low opponent at trying to heal as the flame wall animation is very quick, and it can also be used to start fights to apply the ignite effect and then have a flame wall in the field you can then use to follow your opponent. Conflagration is the last skill for Pyromancer, and its main use is just to spawn miniature fireballs to linger on the battlefield a little longer. It's one of Pyromancer's weaker skills, but the extra damage from the smaller fireballs can sometimes be enough to seal out an exile here and there. The 2 strongest skills of Pyromancer are definitely Combust and Firefly, which unlock at level 1 and level 2 respectively, allowing Pyromancer to have a stellar early game compared to most classes, allowing you to push an early advantage right off the drop. Now we'll get into some final builds you can use for the Pyromancer class. These are subject to change as each patch brings its own balance changes, and as of patch 1.2, my favorite builds to run are going to be listed in this section. The first build I'll talk about is the 222 Runic Fluency, Scavenging, and Recovery with Toxic Offhand and a Dash Rune. This build in particular is great to run in solos and Clash. Runic Fluency gives some extra mobility out of your Dash Rune, and Scavenging and Recovery provide excellent sustain overall. With a Toxic Offhand, your goal is to get in your opponent's face and stay there while you burst them down up close and blow them up with Dragonfire if they try to space themselves out. The second build I like to run is a Mega Tank build with Vigor, Finders Keepers, and Recovery with Stone Offhand and a Dash Rune. Vigor and Recovery make such a great pairing with all the extra sustain that Recovery gives to the extra health from Vigor. Finders Keepers also gives you an increased chance to complete your full scroll build earlier in the game, which makes you so hard to exile. In addition to this, Finders Keepers also gives you a better chance of finding those hidden knowledge potions which are so powerful on stone. Your goal is to stay up close and personal, hitting enemies in the air with fire and punishing grounded enemies with stone for big damage. You should be able to plow through the competition in both squads and in Clash with this build. Of course, I saved my favorite build for last, running Focus Mana, Fervor, and Recovery with Frost Offhand and a Dash Rune. Focus Mana allows me to deal so much extra damage with Fire and Frost as long as I keep my mana above 80%. Fervor lets me follow up and quickly exile a low opponent, and Recovery just provides so much sustain, again as we mentioned in the earlier builds. With this build, you can play at pretty much all ranges, with your favorite being mid to long range with Frost. The key to this build is managing your mana properly, as you can always land increased damage as long as you keep an eye on your mana and spacing out your shots properly. Of course, Fervor is there to help you speed up your damage if you need it in close range. This build in particular is great for the Battle Royale mode in both solos and in squads, and while it is more advanced, I bet you'll enjoy it a lot when you master it. Now we'll get into some of the advanced techniques you can perform with the Pyromancer class. This will be a mix of some hidden tech and some general tricks that I like to use when playing the class myself, so be sure to take note. The first advanced piece of tech you need to know is the Fighter Jet Firefly. This technique is done by falling into a flame wall and timing your Dash Rune just before you hit the ground right next to your flame wall. When done correctly, you'll fly off into the distance much faster and further than a normal Firefly. The next technique I'll show you is what I call the Fire Skid, and it's also done with a Dash Rune. You basically activate your Dash Rune and activate your Flame Wall sorcery right when the dash ends to preserve your momentum and let it carry you into the flame wall to then Firefly to safety. This technique is most used when escaping, as you can put down your flame wall to block Toxic and Frost while fleeing at the same time. You can also use your flame wall to pre-ignite a Toxic Cloud, making it explode on impact just like a regular Dragonfire activation. The last tech I'll leave you with is my favorite to use on a Stone Shaper. It's actually less of a tech and more of an advanced strategy I get a lot of joy out of using. You basically just want to put down a flame wall and use Firefly in between 1 or 2 shots of your Fireball spell. This keeps you up in the air at all times and makes it really hard to hit you, especially for a Stone Shaper. You can also use the Firefly to reposition if you end up getting third-partied as well. To finish up this guide, I'll leave you with some last few tips. The first tip is to always make sure you're playing at your optimal range with fire. It's somewhere between close and mid-range that lets you hit your fireballs very reliably without damaging yourself with combust. Once you find that sweet spot, try not to leave it. Tip number 2 is going to be to make sure you use your flame walls defensively if you need to against Frost and Toxic. Neither of these two elements can pass through your flame wall, so you can use it almost like a literal wall while you drink a potion or set up another attack. And one last tip I'll leave you is to try to push your early game advantage. Pyromancer possesses one of the strongest starting skills in Combust, so be sure to abuse it and push people right away. I personally like to lead with a flame wall and then follow up with fireballs, but either way, get that early damage and finish out the exile. And that is going to do it for my Pyromancer guide video. I really do hope you learned something and enjoyed the video as well. If you personally have any Pyromancer tips, be sure to leave them down in the comments, and do not forget to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and feel free to follow the socials down below. I probably will do a guide for every class now, so stay tuned for those and even more guide videos coming out soon. But anyway, that's going to do it for me. Y'all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all out there.